has argued about it so loudly. Long before it became a headline, a court case, a medicine bottle, a banned substance, a state crop, or a political symbol, it was something much older and simpler. A plant people touched, cut, twisted into rope, pressed for seed, prepared for ritual, carried across mountains, and wrote about in the language of healing, fear, trade, and law. That is what makes its story stranger than the usual debate. Cannabis was never only one thing. In one century, it belonged to farmers and sailors. In another, to physicians and priests. Later, to police files, tax stamps, treaties, patients, laboratories, and lawmakers. The same leaf kept changing its meaning, not because the plant itself changed, but because human societies kept placing it in different hands. If you enjoy these long historical journeys, a quiet like and subscribe helps the channel continue publishing new stories every week. And before the history begins, let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. If there is a specific person, topic, story, civilization, or era you want Quiet Chronicles to cover next, you can leave that there too. The modern argument can wait for later. The older story begins with fiber, seed, soil, and the first long relationship between human hands and a plant that would travel farther than almost anyone expected. Chapter 1. The plant before the argument. Before cannabis belonged to courtrooms, clinics, police ledgers, pharmacies, religious festivals, or political campaigns, it belonged to the older human world of fiber, seed, weather, and work. Its earliest history does not begin as a single dramatic discovery, because plants rarely enter human life that way. They are noticed over time. A stem proves strong when twisted. A seed proves useful when gathered. A field near a settlement gives more of the plant than the open land beyond it, and slowly, without ceremony, a wild growth becomes part of human habit. Cannabis probably first took shape as a plant of the broad Eurasian interior, with deep roots in the regions stretching across Central Asia and into Western China. The exact geography of its earliest domestication remains a matter of scholarly caution, because ancient plant history is built from fragments rather than from clean announcements. Seeds survive where soft leaves do not. Pollen can travel. Fiber can be difficult to assign with certainty after thousands of years have passed. Still, the general outline is strong enough to follow. Long before the plant carried its modern burden of argument, communities across Eurasia were finding value in it. That value was not only, and perhaps not first, intoxication. Hemp fiber was strong, flexible, and practical in a world that needed cordage before it needed written theory. A small strand could bind, fasten, pull, and hold. Many strands together could become rope, netting, rough cloth, or later the rigging of ships. Seeds had their own place, as food, oil, and agricultural memory. The plant was useful in the way that quietly useful things often are. Not dazzling, not royal, not rare, but dependable enough to be kept close. This is one of the notable facts about cannabis history. Modern people often meet the plant through a category first and the plant second. It is called a drug, a medicine, a crop, a crime, a therapy, a commodity, or a symbol before anyone asks what earlier societies actually did with it. Ancient people had fewer such fixed categories. A useful plant could be food, fiber, remedy, ritual substance, and household material without needing to choose one identity for all time. The oldest relationship between cannabis and human beings may be imagined only with restraint. Archaeology does not allow a historian to place an unnamed farmer in a field and fill their hands with certainty. What it does allow is a slower and more careful reconstruction. When plant remains appear in graves, settlements, storage pits, or traces of woven material, they suggest not an isolated curiosity, but repeated contact. A community does not preserve seed by accident across long stretches of time without some practical relation to the plant that produced it. In parts of Western China and the wider Central Asian world, evidence for early cannabis use has drawn particular attention because those regions sat near roots of movement, exchange, and ecological variety. Mountains, basins, dry valleys, and grassland corridors allowed plants, animals, objects, and customs to travel in uneven ways. Cannabis could grow in disturbed soil and human-managed spaces, which meant it followed people well. A plant that likes the edges of settlement can become historical very easily because human beings are always making edges. Field margins, paths, storage areas, grazing lines, and cleared ground. One early identity of cannabis, then, was not rebellion or escape, but settlement itself. It belonged to the world of making things stay together. Fibers drawn from the stem could be worked into cord, and cord was one of the quiet technologies beneath almost everything else. A house needed binding. A pack animal needed securing. A tool might need wrapping at the handle. A fishing net, a basket, a mat, a snare, a bundle of wood, a simple roof support. All of these belong to the long history of fiber before they belong to the long history of metals, money, or states. The seed mattered too. Hemp seed is small, but small foods have carried large histories when they were durable, storable, and available in quantity. In early agricultural societies, the line between food crop and useful weed was not always sharp. Some plants were encouraged before they were formally cultivated. Others grew near human settlements and became part of seasonal gathering. Cannabis could exist in that middle ground, where repeated use slowly changed both the plant and the people who handled it. The first embedded story in this history is therefore not a king issuing a law or a physician naming a medicine, but a quieter scholarly moment. The modern archaeologist standing before fragments that refuse to explain themselves too quickly. A seed in an ancient deposit can say that cannabis was present, but not always why it was present. A woven fiber can say that someone understood the plant's strength, but not what words they used for it. Residue may suggest burning or preparation, but context decides whether the meaning leans toward ritual, medicine, daily use, or something more uncertain. The historian's task is not to make the fragment louder than it is, but to place it beside other fragments until a pattern begins to hold. That pattern points toward a plant with several lives from the beginning. Some communities valued the stem. Others may have noticed the flower. Some kept the seed. Some burned the plant in ritual or medicinal settings. Some transported it unintentionally as part of human movement. The same species could pass from hand to hand without keeping the same meaning, and this becomes one of the recurring features of cannabis history across the centuries. The plant traveled, but its identity was remade wherever it settled. The difference between hemp and psychoactive cannabis also needs careful handling at the beginning, because modern language often separates them more firmly than ancient practice did. Hemp usually refers to cannabis cultivated for fiber, with very low intoxicating effect. Other cannabis varieties or preparations could be valued for resin, smoke, medicine, or altered feeling. Ancient people did not use the chemical vocabulary of modern botany, but they could distinguish practical effects. Farmers, healers, and ritual specialists did not need laboratory terms to notice that one preparation made strong rope and another changed the body's condition. Across early Eurasia, the plant's spread was tied to the same forces that moved many other useful things: migration, trade, pastoral travel, and agricultural borrowing. No single road carried it. No single empire invented its value. Instead, cannabis moved through a broad human mesh of exchange. Seeds could travel with grain stores or baggage. Fiber techniques could pass between neighboring communities. Knowledge of preparation could move along marriage ties, trade contact, religious practice, or the ordinary curiosity that always exists between people who notice what their neighbors use. There is something quietly important in this. Cannabis did not wait for civilization in the grand sense before becoming useful. It did not need palaces, written law, coinage, or armies. Its first history belonged to the level beneath formal history, the level of hands and fields, of tools that had to be tied, bodies that had to be fed, and materials that had to endure weather and strain. Later centuries would wrap the plant in language, theology, medicine, empire, fear, and regulation. But the earliest layer was more practical than symbolic. The move from this practical layer into written memory happened unevenly. Some cultures preserved knowledge through texts. Others left objects, residues, and traces in earth. Written records can feel more authoritative because they speak in sentences, but they are not always older or truer than the mute evidence of materials. A rope fragment, a seed deposit, or a piece of woven hemp may hold a kind of testimony that no ancient author thought to write down. Much of cannabis history survives in this tension between the thing itself and the language later societies built around it. The plant's early story also reminds us that human beings often domesticate usefulness before they domesticate meaning. A crop may be planted for one reason and remembered for another. The same field can produce food, medicine, cloth, and suspicion, depending on who is looking and when. In the long life of cannabis, this would happen again and again. Each age would take hold of the plant through its own concerns, and each age would leave behind a different name for what it thought it had found. From the older Eurasian world, one of the clearest paths of memory leads eastward into China, where cannabis entered a civilization deeply attentive to agriculture, classification, medicine, and practical material life. There, the plant would not appear as a modern controversy, but as something woven into the ordinary and intellectual fabric of an ancient society. Cloth on the body, seed in the storehouse, fiber in the hand, and, eventually, a place in the written traditions of healing. Chapter 2: China and the Useful Leaf. China gives cannabis one of its earliest broad historical homes, not because every detail of its beginning there can be fixed with perfect certainty, but because Chinese civilization preserved an unusually rich memory of plants, crops, fibers, foods, and medicines. In that memory, hemp did not arrive as a strange visitor from the edge of society. It belonged close to agriculture, to household work, to clothing, to rope, to seed, and to the careful habit of naming what the natural world could provide. The Chinese word often associated with hemp, ma, carried a long life in writing and daily use. It could point toward the plant as a material crop before it pointed toward any later idea of intoxication. Early Chinese society depended heavily on plant fibers, and hemp was one of the important fibers before cotton became widespread in later centuries. A society that needed cloth for ordinary people, cords for tying, nets for work, and sacks for storage could not treat a strong fibrous plant as a curiosity. It became part of the practical order of life. Hemp cloth had a particular place in older China because silk, though famous, was not the clothing of everyone. Silk belonged to status, ceremony, and wealth, while hemp could belong to labor, morning dress, common garments, and rougher household needs. A field of hemp did not carry the glamour of a silkworm house, but it met a different need. It could clothe bodies that did not appear in court poetry. It could make the plain fabrics through which a large civilization actually lived. This is a useful correction at the beginning of the Chinese story. The history of a plant is often distorted when later fame selects only one use and forgets all the others. Cannabis did not enter China only through medicine, and it certainly did not enter only through altered states. It entered through the material intelligence of farmers and households, through the recognition that stems could be stripped and worked, that seeds could be gathered, and that the plant could stand among other useful crops without requiring special drama. Chinese agricultural thought developed with a strong awareness of classification. Plants were known by season, soil, use, taste, effect, and place within the human order. Hemp could be described as part of the old group of staple or near-staple crops, sometimes named among the ancient grains or essential cultivated plants in later traditions. Such lists were not modern botanical documents, but they show a civilization thinking of hemp as ordinary enough to belong near the center of useful life. The plant's value lay partly in its ability to serve several needs at once. The seed had its own quieter history. Hemp seed could be eaten, pressed, or understood as part of the food and medicinal world. In a society where food and medicine often overlapped, this mattered. Seeds were not merely calories. They could be classified by the way they acted on the body, by their texture, their flavor, and their place in systems of balance. The same seed that entered storage could also enter a healer's vocabulary, and this movement from granary to remedy did not require a sharp boundary. The medical memory of cannabis in China is often drawn toward the figure of Shennong, the divine farmer, whose name became attached to one of the most famous early traditions of Chinese materia medica. Shennong himself belongs to the legendary past rather than to securely documented biography. Later texts remembered him as a culture hero who tasted plants, taught agriculture, and helped human beings understand the healing and harmful powers of the natural world. In that remembered world, cannabis appeared not as an isolated marvel, but as one substance among many that required classification, caution, and use. The important point is not that one can watch Shennong personally testing cannabis in some recoverable historical moment. The important point is that Chinese tradition placed hemp within a larger pharmacological imagination, where plants were not merely named but sorted according to their effects. Later readers inherited a world in which cannabis could be part of medicine, because medicine itself was a long conversation among texts, teachers, patients, and substances. A plant became reliable not through one dramatic discovery, but through repeated notice and written transmission. The classical medical tradition did not treat all parts of the plant as identical. Seeds, leaves, flowers, and other preparations could carry different meanings, and this is another reminder that cannabis history is rarely simple when seen up close. Modern debates often speak as though the plant has one identity, but older pharmacological cultures were more attentive to preparation, what was gathered, how it was dried, which part was used, and how it was combined with other substances could matter as much as the plant's name. Hemp also belonged to writing and record keeping, though indirectly and in varied ways. Before paper became common, China used materials such as bamboo slips and silk for writing, and later papermaking drew on plant fibers, rags, bark, and hemp materials in different combinations. The history of paper is not simply the history of one plant, but hemp was among the fibrous resources that helped make writing more flexible and less dependent on heavier or costlier surfaces. A plant that could bind a bundle could also, in altered form, help carry a word. Here the story widens beyond the body. Cannabis was not only something people consumed, wore, or prescribed. It was part of the material culture that allowed a society to hold itself together. Rope could fasten, cloth could cover, seed could nourish, fiber could become a writing surface. These uses do not sound sensational, but they are historically powerful precisely because they are repetitive. A civilization is often sustained by things that are used so often they become almost invisible. The practical value of hemp also placed it inside labor. Stems had to be harvested, soaked, stripped, dried, beaten, combed, twisted, or woven, depending on the intended use and local method. The finished cloth, or cord, hid much of this work. A simple length of hemp rope carried inside it the field where the plant grew, the hands that processed it, the time spent softening and separating fiber, and the knowledge required to make a plant stem useful. Cannabis history, at this level, is a history of technique. Chinese records and traditions also show how easily useful plants moved between everyday life and symbolic life. Hemp could appear in mourning dress because coarse or plain fabric had ritual meaning. To wear rough hemp in grief was not merely to use available material, it could express humility, loss, and social order. In this way, the plant entered ceremonies, not because it was exotic, but because ordinary materials often become the language of serious occasions. The plainness of hemp could carry meaning precisely because everyone knew what kind of material it was. This is one of the quieter patterns in the Chinese chapter of cannabis history. The plant was not forced into a single role. It could be agricultural, medical, textile, ritual, and practical without any one identity cancelling the others. A later age might separate these categories into different offices, different laws, different moral judgments, and different industries. Earlier, China allowed them to sit closer together because a useful plant naturally moved through several rooms of life. As trade and cultural exchange widened across Inner Asia, Chinese knowledge of hemp existed alongside other traditions beyond China's borders. The plant was not sealed inside one civilization. It grew across ecological and cultural zones, and each society noticed different features. For China, the long memory of cannabis leaned strongly toward usefulness. The crop in the field, the fiber in the hand, the seed in the storehouse, the substance in the physician's list, the plain cloth in ritual use. That emphasis would remain one of the great counterweights to later histories that remembered cannabis only through fear or intoxication. From this Chinese world of classification and use, the story begins to turn south and west, toward a setting where cannabis would gather a different kind of intimacy. In India, the plant entered not only the field and the healer's shelf, but the household cup, the festival calendar, and the religious imagination. The same plant that had been woven, stored, and catalogued would now be prepared, consumed, blessed, debated, and remembered in forms that carried it much closer to the inner life of ritual and the body. Chapter 3: India, Bang, and the Sacred Household. India received cannabis into a world where plants were rarely only plants. They could be food, medicine, offering, poison, blessing, habit, comfort, and danger, depending on the text that named them, the hand that prepared them, the season in which they were used, and the body that received them. Cannabis did not enter this world as a single fixed substance. It entered through preparations, associations, and local customs, and in India those forms became especially layered because ritual life, household practice, and medical thinking often stood much closer together than modern categories allow. The plant appears in South Asian history through several names and preparations, and each name carries its own setting. Bang, often made from the leaves and sometimes prepared as a drink, became one of the most recognizable forms. Ganja, associated more with flowering tops, and charas, associated with resin, belonged to different preparations and different intensities. Such distinctions mattered, because cannabis was not simply taken as an abstract plant. It was washed, dried, ground, strained, mixed, sweetened, offered, prescribed, restricted, tolerated, celebrated, and sometimes criticized. Ancient Indian references are not always easy to date or interpret with modern precision. Some traditions connect cannabis with sacred life, especially with Shiva, and later devotional practice gave the plant a place in religious imagination. Other references belong to medicine, where cannabis could be classified according to its effects on appetite, sleep, pain, digestion, or bodily balance. The historian has to move carefully here because the temptation is to make one grand statement about India and cannabis, when the truth is more regional, more varied, and more slowly accumulated. Bang offers the most approachable doorway into this part of the story because it sat at the meeting place of preparation and custom. Leaves could be ground into a paste with water or milk, then mixed with spices, nuts, sugar, or other ingredients, depending on region and occasion. The result could be a drink, cooling and heavy in the body, associated in some settings with festivals and religious observance. It was not merely the plant in raw form. It was the plant converted into a social and ritual substance through labor, recipe, and inherited expectation. The preparation itself reveals something important. A substance becomes historical when it acquires a method. Grinding stones, bowls, strainers, milk, pepper, almonds, rosewater, or sugar do not all belong to every preparation or every period, but the broader fact remains. Cannabis in India was often mediated through culinary and medicinal technique. It did not always appear as smoke or secrecy. It could appear as a drink in a cup, as part of a seasonal gathering, as something placed within the ordinary knowledge of how bodies respond to heat, hunger, fatigue, and celebration. The religious associations of cannabis in India must be handled with respect and proportion. The plant has long been linked in popular devotion with Shiva, especially in certain Shaivite settings, where bhang could be treated as an offering or consumed in ritual contexts. Yet Hindu practice is vast, and no single custom can stand for the whole. Some communities embraced the association, others did not center it. Some used cannabis on particular festival days, others approached the plant with caution. A sacred association in historical life rarely means universal approval. This is where the Indian story becomes especially useful for understanding cannabis more broadly. In one society, a plant may be condemned because it changes the mind. In another, the same property may be interpreted through discipline, devotion, medicine, or controlled festivity. The effect is not ignored, but neither is it automatically placed outside order. India's cannabis traditions show that intoxication, when present, could be surrounded by rules, recipes, gods, households, markets, physicians, and moral argument. It did not exist outside culture, it was held inside it. Ayurvedic medicine gave the plant another kind of frame. Classical and later medical traditions in South Asia classified substances by qualities, actions, and effects, and cannabis could appear as a powerful substance requiring care. It might be described in relation to appetite, digestion, pain, sleep, sexual energy, bowel function, or mental state, though such uses varied across texts and periods. The important historical point is not to turn these references into modern medical advice, but to notice that cannabis had been placed within a disciplined language of bodily effect long before modern pharmacology named cannabinoids or receptors. A physician working within that older world did not think like a modern laboratory researcher, but that does not mean the older system lacked observation. Bodies were watched, effects were compared, substances were corrected, combined, heated, cooled, purified, or balanced against other ingredients. Cannabis, because it was strong, could be treated as useful and risky at once. That double status, remedy and danger, blessing and excess, would follow the plant across many civilizations. The miniature at the center of this chapter is not an invented worshipper at a temple or an unnamed healer in a courtyard, but the recorded practice of bhang itself as a prepared cultural substance. In descriptions from later Indian life, especially around festivals such as Holi and certain Shaivite observances, bhang was not simply consumed, it was made. The leaves were reduced by hand, mixed into a base that softened bitterness, and carried into a setting already marked by season, color, devotion, and social permission. Its meaning came as much from the occasion as from the plant. That distinction matters. A cup of bhang in a ritual or festival setting was not the same social object as the same substance in another context. The preparation could be tolerated, honored, mocked, restricted, or condemned depending on who consumed it, when, and how. India's long cannabis history, therefore, cannot be reduced to approval or disapproval. It is a history of placement. The plant's acceptability depended on its relationship to time, caste and community, gendered practice, religious identity, local custom, bodily discipline, and the visible boundaries of moderation. Markets also carried cannabis into daily life. In towns and villages, cannabis preparations could pass through cellars, tax systems, local regulation, and informal habit. The plant was not only preserved in scripture or medicine, it moved through exchange. A substance known by healers and devotees could also be known by officials, revenue collectors, householders, and laborers. Later colonial governments would study and tax these practices with bureaucratic intensity, but they did not invent the complexity they found. They entered a world where cannabis already had many lives. There is a quiet caution here for every later century. Outsiders often misunderstand a plant when they notice only the part that unsettles them. British colonial observers, missionaries, physicians, and administrators would later look at Indian cannabis use through their own anxieties and categories. Some were curious and careful. Others were suspicious. Yet the older Indian world had already done what many societies do with powerful substances. It had given them names, forms, customs, warnings, and occasions. The plant was not wild simply because it altered the body. It was made social. The household scale remained important. A preparation like bhang could belong to festival joy, but it could also belong to digestion, heat, fatigue, or the desire to settle the body. In hot climates, cooling drinks and bodily theories mattered. In agrarian life, substances that affected appetite, rest, and endurance were not abstract luxuries. They were interpreted through work, weather, age, and health. Cannabis, in this frame, was part of a larger world of plant knowledge that included spices, oils, herbs, roots, seeds, and foods with medicinal reputations. At the same time, Indian traditions did not erase concern. Strong substances invite warnings wherever they are known well. Cannabis could be criticized for excess, dullness, dependency, or social disorder, especially when use appeared outside accepted limits. This tension gave the plant a moral shape without making it purely forbidden. It could be revered in one setting and disapproved in another. It could be medicine in one preparation and vice in another. Such distinctions are difficult for modern argument, which prefers a single verdict, but they are common in long histories. The Indian chapter of cannabis history therefore deepens the story that began with fiber and seed. In China, cannabis had appeared strongly as a useful crop and classified substance. In India, it became more visibly a prepared experience, something shaped by recipe, ritual, medicine, climate, and social permission. The plant's identity widened. It was no longer only a stem to be stripped or a seed to be stored. It was something that entered the body with meaning attached to it. From the household cup and the festival setting, the story turns again toward movement across the wider Eurasian world. North and west of India, through Iranian lands and the broad steppe corridors, cannabis would gather another set of associations. There, Greek writers, nomadic customs, burial objects, and the difficult evidence of smoke and seed would place the plant inside a world of horses, tents, ritual heat, and cultural distance, where the historian must read carefully between a written account and the objects left in frozen earth. Chapter 4: The Scythians and the Smoke of the Steppe. The Scythian part of cannabis history begins with a difficulty that is also a gift. The evidence comes from two different kinds of memory. One memory was written by a Greek, Herodotus, looking toward the peoples of the steppe with curiosity, distance, and the habits of an outsider. The other memory remained in objects: seeds, censers, burial chambers, felt coverings, and the preserved material of the Eurasian interior. Neither memory is complete by itself. Placed together, they allow cannabis to appear in a world very different from the field, the pharmacological list, or the household cup. Herodotus wrote in the 5th century BCE about the Scythians, a broad name the Greeks used for mounted peoples of the northern Black Sea and the wider steppe world. His account is not a simple window through which everything can be seen without distortion. Greek ethnography often mixed observation, rumor, fascination, and comparison, because Greek writers described foreign customs partly to understand Greece itself. Yet Herodotus remains valuable because he noticed practices that would otherwise have passed without written record, and among those practices was a striking description of hemp. In his account, Scythians used hemp seed in a ritual or cleansing practice after burial. They were said to place seeds on heated stones inside a small enclosed space, where the rising vapor or smoke filled the air. Herodotus described the participants responding with delight, and later readers have often returned to this passage because it gives one of the earliest written descriptions of cannabis used for its vapor or smoke. The scene has sometimes been repeated too dramatically, as though it were a theatrical spectacle. Read carefully. It is better understood as one part of a larger funerary and social world. The Scythians were not a single tribe with one fixed way of life. They were part of a wider steppe ecology where horses, mobility, grazing, raiding, trade, and burial display shaped power and identity. Greek colonies on the Black Sea encountered them through commerce, diplomacy, war, and rumor. The steppe was not empty land beyond civilization. It was a highly organized world with its own wealth, hierarchy, skill, and ritual order. Cannabis entered that world not as an isolated curiosity, but as one useful substance among the materials that moved with people who understood distance well. The written account became more compelling when archaeological finds from the Altai region, especially the Pasric burials, gave material evidence that seemed to stand near Herodotus' description. These frozen tombs, dating from the early Iron Age, preserved objects that would normally have vanished. Textiles, wooden structures, leather, felt, and other organic remains. Among the finds were items interpreted as connected to hemp or cannabis use, including seeds and equipment that scholars have associated with fumigation or ritual preparation. The frozen earth did not explain everything, but it kept more than ordinary soil would have allowed. The Pasric burials themselves belonged to a world of extraordinary material care. Horses were buried with elaborate equipment. Textiles carried designs that moved between cultures. Wooden chambers, felt hangings, and personal objects reflected status and ceremony. The people buried there were not anonymous shadows at the edge of history. They belonged to societies that invested labor, wealth, and meaning into death. Cannabis, when found in such a context, must be read inside that seriousness. It was not merely a substance consumed casually beside a fire. It stood near ritual, body, status, and passage. This is where the historian has to be careful. Herodotus and Pasric do not simply prove one another in a perfect line. They come from related but not identical regions and contexts, and the Scythian world was broad. Yet the comparison is powerful because it shows how a written description and material remains can answer each other across distance. Herodotus gives an action: hemp seed, heated stones, enclosed space, vapor. Archaeology gives objects: seeds, containers, burial environments, preserved materials. Between them, a practice begins to acquire shape without needing to be exaggerated. The miniature here is not the imagined interior of a tent, but the meeting of those two records. Herodotus, writing for Greek readers, preserved a description of hemp fumigation as part of Scythian custom. Many centuries later, excavators working in the cold ground of the Altai uncovered tombs that contained the kind of material culture that made such descriptions feel less remote. A seed in a burial chamber is not a sentence, and a sentence in a Greek history is not an artifact. But together they create a historical conversation, each one limiting and strengthening the other. Cannabis in this steppe setting was therefore not simply agricultural. It was connected to smoke, heat, and perhaps purification or transition. If the practice followed burial, as Herodotus said, then the plant belonged near death, but not in a morbid or graphic sense. It belonged to the ordered actions that communities perform when a life has passed from the living group. Many cultures surround death with washing, smoke, incense, food, cloth, lament, procession, or controlled silence. The Scythian use of hemp, if understood in that broad human frame, becomes less strange and more historically legible. The steppe also mattered because it was a corridor rather than a wall. Peoples of the Eurasian grasslands connected regions that agricultural empires often described as separate. Goods, animals, metals, textiles, stories, and practices moved along routes that did not always leave written documents. Cannabis could travel in the same way. Seeds could move in bags, in trade, in fodder, in settlement margins, or through deliberate carrying. A plant known in China, India, and Central Asia did not need a single imperial road to spread. The steppe itself supplied movement. Greek contact with Scythians added another layer to the plant's history. To Greek writers, foreign customs often appeared as mirrors of difference. A practice involving hemp vapor could be recorded because it seemed unusual, memorable, or useful in marking Scythians as distinct. But Greek curiosity was not neutral. It selected what surprised Greek readers. This means that cannabis may appear in the written record precisely at the point where it looked unusual to an outsider, while more ordinary uses of the plant remained unmentioned. What was common to Scythians could become remarkable only when a Greek wrote it down. The material details of this world are important because they keep the chapter from floating into legend. Heated stones suggest a practical method for releasing vapor. Felt coverings or enclosed spaces suggest knowledge of how to contain heat and smoke. Seeds point toward a prepared supply rather than accidental burning. Burial chambers reveal a society that placed objects in relation to memory, rank, and the afterlife or ancestral order. None of these details needs to be sharpened into spectacle. Their quiet force lies in how practical they are. From the perspective of cannabis history, the Scythian evidence changes the plant's profile. In the early agricultural story, cannabis had been stem and seed. In China, it had become fiber, food, and classified medicine. In India, it had become preparation, drink, ritual, and bodily effect. Among the Scythian and related steppe worlds, it appears through smoke and ceremony, through a practice attached to social identity and perhaps to funerary order. The plant's identity keeps widening, but not randomly. Each society notices the part that fits its own habits of life. The Scythian chapter also shows why cannabis history cannot be written only from laws and medical books. Some of its most important evidence lies in things without voices. A casket, a censer, a seed deposit, a preserved textile, a felt covering, a horse harness, or a Greek sentence written from afar can each carry one part of the record. None of them is enough alone. Together, they show a plant moving through environments where writing was not always the main keeper of memory. There is a quiet lesson in the way Herodotus and archaeology meet here. Ancient cannabis use was neither a modern invention nor a single universal practice. It was older, more regional, and more varied than later debates often admit. The same plant could be rope in one place, seed food in another, a physician's substance elsewhere, and smoke in a ritual setting on the steppe. The historian does not need to force these identities into agreement. Their difference is the point. As the story moves away from the grasslands and toward the Mediterranean, cannabis enters another world of classification. Greek and Roman writers did not preserve the plant only through wonder at foreign customs. They also placed it inside the calmer pages of practical knowledge: botany, medicine, agriculture, rope, seed, and trade. The vapor of the steppe gives way to the catalogue of the physician and the storehouse of the empire, where cannabis would be named less as mystery than as a useful material among many. Chapter 5. The Mediterranean catalogues the plant. The Mediterranean world received cannabis with a different kind of attention. Here, the plant entered not only through field, ritual, or steppe custom, but through the habit of cataloguing. Greek and Roman writers were heirs to a culture that liked to name substances, compare their effects, assign them to practical use, and preserve them in lists. A plant could be described because it healed, because it fed animals, because it produced fiber, because it was traded, or because it belonged to the enormous inventory of useful things that allowed households, armies, ships, and farms to continue. Cannabis did not become one of the grand symbolic plants of the classical imagination in the way that olive, laurel, vine, or myrtle did. It did not stand at the center of poetry or civic identity. Its place was quieter and more practical. It belonged to the category of plants that mattered because they could be used, and usefulness in the ancient world was never a small thing. Rope, cloth, seed, oil, medicine, and animal care all belong to the hidden architecture of daily life, the part of history that does not always receive monuments, but without which monuments cannot be built. Greek knowledge of plants came from many sources. Farmers carried inherited experience. Physicians observed bodies and remedies. Traders brought unfamiliar substances through ports and markets. Soldiers encountered local practices while moving through foreign regions. Writers gathered these fragments into texts, and texts gave them a longer memory. Cannabis entered this world of collection and ordering, not as a stranger that overturned medical thought, but as one entry among many in the wide Mediterranean attempt to understand what nature could provide. Dioscorides gives the plant one of its most important classical homes. A Greek physician of the 1st century CE, he served in the Roman imperial world and wrote a vast work on medicinal substances known in Latin tradition as De Materia Medica. His book traveled through centuries because it answered a practical need. Physicians, monks, translators, scholars, and apothecaries returned to it because it gathered plants, minerals, animal products, and preparations into a durable medical inventory. Cannabis appeared within that kind of book, and that placement matters. The miniature here begins with the position of Dioscorides rather than with a dramatic scene, because his importance lies in the role he occupied. He was not trying to make cannabis famous. He was placing it where it belonged in a medical and practical order. In the pages associated with his tradition, hemp could be discussed for its seed, its juice, its effect on the body, and its usefulness. The calmness of the entry is part of its value. Cannabis was not being announced as a wonder. It was being recorded as a known substance. A catalogue may seem dry, but in ancient medicine, it was a powerful form of memory. To be included in a Materia Medica meant that a plant had crossed from local use into written transmission. It could now travel without the plant itself. A reader in a later century might never meet the same farmers or traders who knew cannabis in its practical settings, yet the description could remain. Texts carried the plant across language, empire, and time, even when the fields where it grew changed hands. Roman society, like Greek society before it, had a strong need for fibers. The empire was held together by roads, ships, military supply, cities, farms, and long-distance movement, and all of these depended on materials that rarely appear in heroic narrative. Rope was one of them. A rope could secure cargo, hold a sail, bind a frame, draw water, manage animals, support building work, or serve military logistics. Hemp fiber, where available and suitable, belonged to that larger world of binding and carrying. Sailcloth and cordage connect cannabis to the sea. The Mediterranean was not merely a body of water between lands. It was the central road of the classical world. Grain moved from Egypt and North Africa. Wine, oil, pottery, marble, metals, timber, papyrus, slaves, soldiers, and messages crossed from port to port. Ships required constant maintenance, and maintenance required fiber. A damaged sail or weakened rope could matter more immediately than a decree from Rome, because empire depended on movement before it depended on ceremony. Seed also remained part of the plant's Mediterranean identity. Ancient writers sometimes described hemp seed in relation to bodily effects, food, or treatment, though not always in ways that align neatly with modern categories. The old medical world did not divide substances into the clean shelves of modern pharmacy. Food could have medical quality. Medicine could be prepared from ordinary agricultural material. A seed could nourish, disturb, warm, cool, dry, loosen, or strengthen, according to the theories and observations of the time. Cannabis seed entered that language as part of a wider system of natural effects. Galen, the great physician of the 2nd century CE, belonged to another stage of classical medical memory. His work, immense in scale and influence, shaped medicine for many centuries after him. When ancient and later medical writers mentioned cannabis, they placed it into the inherited conversation about bodies, humors, digestion, pain, and remedy. Their understanding was not modern pharmacology, but it was not random guessing either. It was a disciplined world of comparison, classification, and repeated use, even when its theories later became outdated. A quiet historical point emerges here. Cannabis was not always most visible where it was most feared. In the classical Mediterranean, its presence often appears in the low, steady language of use. That does not mean ancient writers were unaware of strong bodily effects, or that every preparation was treated as harmless. It means that the plant had not yet been reduced to one moral category. It could be handled as a practical substance, and practicality has a way of softening the sharp edges of judgment. Veterinary and agricultural knowledge also belong to this wider setting. Ancient households and estates depended on animals, and animals required treatment. Plants that affected the body could be used not only for human ailments, but also for livestock and working animals, depending on local knowledge and textual tradition. The same farm that grew fiber could also produce seeds, oil, fodder, and remedies. In the ancient world, the separation between agriculture and medicine was often much thinner than in the modern one. Trade helped keep cannabis within a broad Mediterranean network. Some regions were better suited to growing fiber crops than others, and the Roman economy could move materials over long distances when demand justified it. Ports, markets, and military supply systems made the empire a machine of circulation. A bale of fiber, a bundle of rope, a sack of seed, or a written reference in a physician's book could each move differently, but all belonged to the same pattern. Useful things traveled because large societies consumed useful things constantly. The classical world also shows how naming a plant can preserve it while narrowing it. A Greek or Latin term may point toward cannabis, hemp, or related preparations, yet ancient vocabulary does not always map perfectly onto modern botanical certainty. Translators, copyists, and later scholars had to identify plants across languages, regions, and centuries. This makes the history of cannabis partly a history of words. A plant survives in a text, but the text must still be interpreted, and interpretation carries its own risks. Still, the broad outline remains firm. Cannabis was known. Hemp was useful. Medical writers recorded the plant. Fiber mattered to ships, households, and work. Seed and preparations belong to ancient discussions of bodily effect. The Mediterranean world did not invent cannabis, and it did not make the plant central to its imagination, but it gave it a durable place in the written and practical record. That place was modest, but modest things often endure well. The contrast with India and the steppe is instructive. In India, cannabis could be drawn into ritual drink, seasonal practice, and sacred association. On the steppe, it appeared through smoke, burial, and the comparison between Greek testimony and archaeological remains. In the Mediterranean, it settled into catalogue, craft, and material routine. These differences are not contradictions. They are evidence of the plant's ability to become local. Cannabis did not carry one meaning from civilization to civilization. It met each society's existing needs and entered through the door that was already open. As the Roman world changed and the old Mediterranean order gave way to late antique, Byzantine, Persian, Arab, and Islamic systems of trade and knowledge, cannabis continued to move. Its fiber remained useful, but another preparation began to draw more attention in medieval writing: hashish. The plant that classical authors had catalogued in measured terms would soon appear in cities, legal discussions, devotional margins, market anxieties, and moral debates, where the question was no longer only what cannabis could do, but what kind of society its use seemed to reveal. Chapter 6: Hashish, Cities, and Medieval Unease. The medieval Islamic world gave cannabis a more complicated public life, especially through hashish. Hemp as fiber did not disappear, and the plant still belonged to ordinary material use in fields, ropes, cloth, and trade. But the written record begins to speak more noticeably about preparations that changed the body and unsettled moral authorities. The word hashish itself could carry different meanings across time and place, sometimes referring broadly to dried plant matter, sometimes more specifically to cannabis preparations. In the cities of the medieval Middle East, that word gathered attention because it seemed to sit at the border between medicine, pleasure, poverty, discipline, and disorder. Islamic civilization inherited and transformed many streams of knowledge. Greek medicine passed through translation into Arabic. Persian court culture, Indian substances, caravan trade, urban markets, and religious scholarship all met in cities that were intellectually rich and socially varied. Plants and drugs moved through this world in many forms: opium, henbane, mandrake, spices, perfumes, resins, and countless medicinal herbs. Cannabis did not stand alone. It belonged to a larger universe of substances that could be sold, prescribed, feared, enjoyed, condemned, taxed, or folded into habit. A city such as Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, or Nishapur was not a single moral world. It contained jurists, merchants, soldiers, laborers, mystics, physicians, poets, officials, beggars, artisans, and travelers. A substance could mean one thing in a medical text, another in a market, another in a devotional margin, and another in a judge's warning. Hashish entered that mixed life with unusual visibility because it touched questions that medieval scholars and rulers cared about deeply: self-command, public order, religious duty, bodily discipline, and the danger of habits that loosened a person's place in the social order. The juristic concern around hashish did not arise in a vacuum. Islamic law had long treated wine and intoxication as serious matters, and scholars debated how to understand substances that were not grape wine but could still cloud judgment. Hashish forced a difficult question into view: if a substance altered the mind but did not fit the older vocabulary of wine exactly, how should it be judged? Different scholars answered with different levels of severity, yet many came to regard it with suspicion or prohibition, especially when its use appeared connected to neglect of prayer, public disorder, or moral slackening. The records that survive are often records of concern. This matters. Historians hear loudest from people who objected, regulated, preached, or punished, because objections produce documents. Ordinary use leaves fewer traces. A jurist warning against hashish, a ruler ordering enforcement, or a moralist describing social decline may preserve evidence of the substance's presence, but not necessarily a balanced picture of everyone who used it. The medieval record, therefore, has to be read with patience. Anxiety is evidence, but it is not the whole society speaking. Cairo offers one of the richest settings for this part of the story. In the later medieval period, the city was crowded, layered, and alive with movement. Scholars around mosques and madrasas, merchants moving through markets, soldiers attached to ruling households, craftsmen working in narrow trades, pilgrims arriving and departing, and poor quarters where official authority often saw danger before it saw ordinary survival. Hashish appears in some accounts as something consumed by marginal groups, wandering ascetics, or the urban poor, though such descriptions often carry the disdain of elite writers. The plant's social meaning was being shaped not only by its effect, but by the status of the people associated with it. A miniature from this world begins not with an invented user in an alley, but with the institution of complaint itself. Medieval writers who condemned hashish often described it as a substance that weakened discipline, dulled intelligence, or drew people away from proper conduct. Their language did more than report a habit. It created a social image. Hashish became, in these texts, a sign of loosened boundaries. The plant's preparation mattered less than what it seemed to represent. A body not governed as it should be, a mind not clear enough for duty, a gathering not supervised by respectable order. That image was powerful because medieval cities were sensitive to visible behavior. Public life depended on reputation, religious observance, guild practice, family standing, and the constant nearness of neighbors. A habit that could be practiced privately still became public when it altered speech, work, prayer, debt, or social discipline. Hashish therefore entered moral writing as a plant that revealed more than appetite. It seemed to reveal class, character, and the ability or failure of authority to govern the city. Sufi associations complicated the picture further. Some mystical circles, or groups described as antinomian by critics, were linked in certain sources with hashish use. Here again, care is necessary. Sufism was not one thing, and the disciplined spiritual orders of the Islamic world cannot be reduced to the practices of marginal groups or the accusations of opponents. Still, cannabis preparations appear at times near the edges of devotional culture, especially where altered feeling, poverty, renunciation, music, wandering, or ecstatic practice unsettled more formal religious authorities. What one group saw as loosening worldly attachment, another could see as dangerous self-deception. The plant also passed through medical and pharmacological channels. Islamic medicine, shaped by Greek inheritance and original observation, took substances seriously according to their qualities and effects. Physicians knew that drugs could heal, harm, sedate, stimulate, purge, relieve pain, or disturb the balance of the body. Cannabis preparations could therefore appear not only in moral discourse, but within the broader medical habit of classifying powerful materials. This double visibility made the plant difficult to contain. A substance known to physicians could also be known to pleasure seekers. A substance condemned in one setting might be measured in another. Markets made such ambiguity practical. A city market did not merely sell food and cloth. It carried dyes, oils, perfumes, medicinal herbs, resins, spices, paper, cordage, and substances that crossed the line between remedy and indulgence. Hashish, when sold or prepared in urban settings, became part of this economy of small transactions. Its movement could be regulated, but regulation itself implies circulation. A ruler does not issue orders against something that no one can find. A jurist does not spend careful language on a habit that has no audience. Rulers sometimes acted against hashish fields, sellers, or users, though enforcement varied and could depend on local politics. Some campaigns were moral, some administrative, some symbolic. Destroying a crop or punishing sellers could present a ruler as guardian of public order, especially in moments when cities felt difficult to govern. Yet such measures rarely erased the plant. Cannabis was too adaptable, too easily grown, and too connected to wider networks of use. Suppression could change its visibility, its price, its social meaning, or its risk, but not its existence. The social vocabulary around hashish often carried class judgment. Elite writers could describe users as idle, foolish, degraded, or disorderly, and those descriptions influenced later memory. The plant was not merely being assessed for its bodily effect, it was being placed within a hierarchy of respectability. Wine, though clearly prohibited in Islamic law, had long associations with poetry, courts, and elite transgression. Hashish, in many hostile accounts, was pushed lower, attached to commonness, poverty, or vulgarity. The difference reveals how substances are judged not only by what they do, but by who is imagined using them. There is a quiet continuity here with other parts of cannabis history. In India, bhang could be held inside ritual occasion and household preparation. On the steppe, hemp smoke could belong to funerary custom. In the medieval Islamic city, hashish was more often drawn into debates over order, discipline, and public morality. The plant's effect did not change as dramatically as the social frame around it. Meaning gathered from setting. A preparation in a cup, a vapor in a burial rite, and a cake in an urban market could all belong to cannabis while carrying very different historical weights. The Islamic world also transmitted knowledge. Arabic and Persian medical texts, trade networks, and scholarly routes helped substances and descriptions move across regions. Cannabis preparations could be known from Egypt to Syria, from Persia to North Africa and beyond, though never in one uniform pattern. Trade did not make culture flat. It made variation possible across connected places. A plant might be tolerated in one town, condemned in another, used medically in one text, mocked in a poem, taxed by an official, or pursued by a moral reformer. Language itself continued to shift. Hashish could become a term heavy with suspicion, while hemp as a fiber remained ordinary enough to attract little moral notice. This split between the material plant and the intoxicating preparation became one of the enduring features of cannabis history. The rope did not scandalize. The cloth did not trouble the jurist in the same way. The prepared substance, entering the body and altering conduct, drew attention because it touched the moral center of social life. One plant carried both identities, but the record treated them differently. Medieval unease did not erase medieval familiarity. The very richness of the discussion shows that cannabis had become woven into urban life deeply enough to require explanation. It was known to scholars, sellers, rulers, physicians, critics, mystics, and ordinary people whose names do not survive. Some feared it. Some used it. Some classified it. Some tried to remove it. Some folded it into practice and moved on. The history is not a verdict. It is a record of negotiation. As this urban and moral history continued across the Islamic world, another cannabis history was gathering strength in Europe with far less scandal attached to it. There, the plant's fiber mattered more than its resin, and hemp entered the service of states, ships, ropes, sails, and paper. The same species that troubled jurists in one setting would become a material of empire in another, stretched along rope walks, packed into bales, and drawn through the hands of workers whose labor helped carry Europe onto the sea. Chapter 7: Rope, Canvas, and the Sea. Europe's cannabis history becomes quieter after the medieval arguments over hashish, but it does not become less important. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, the plant was not first remembered as a substance of the body, or as a source of religious unease, or as something that belonged to law courts and moral writing. It was remembered through hemp, the tall, fibrous crop that could be cut, soaked, dried, beaten, combed, spun, twisted, woven, and made to serve the hard practical needs of a world held together by cordage. A ship made this need visible better than almost anything else. The wooden hull was only one part of the vessel. Its life depended on rope, sailcloth, Nets, lines, rigging, caulking materials, sacks, and repair supplies, all of them consumed, worn down, replaced, and demanded again. The Navy was therefore not only a collection of ships, it was a system of forests, tar, iron, canvas, hemp fields, rope walks, storehouses, contracts, inspectors, and workers whose names rarely entered grand histories. Hemp belonged to that hidden system with unusual force. Medieval Europe already used hemp in many ordinary ways. Villages and towns needed rope for animals, wells, carts, mills, fishing, lifting, binding, and transport. Cloth made from hemp could be rough but durable. Nets for rivers and coasts depended on strong fiber. Sacks and packing materials carried grain, wool, salt, and other goods. Paper makers later used rags and fibers that could include hemp, giving the plant another indirect life in the preservation of accounts, letters, religious texts, and commercial records. In these uses, cannabis did not appear as an exotic plant. It appeared as work. The transformation came when European states became more dependent on maritime power. A small fishing boat needed cordage, but a warship needed it in staggering quantity. Every mast, sail, anchor, cargo hold, gun, pulley, and repair operation required rope or canvas somewhere in the chain. Salt water weakened material. Weather tore fabric. Long voyages consumed supplies. A fleet preparing for war or trade could create a hunger for hemp that reached far beyond the harbor, into fields, warehouses, and international trade routes. This is why hemp became a matter of state attention. Rulers and naval administrators did not think about the plant only as farmers did. They thought about supply. If rope failed, ships failed. If ships failed, trade, war, taxation, and empire all weakened. The plant's value in this setting was not symbolic but strategic. A field of hemp could stand very far from the sea and still belong to the sea, because its fiber might one day hold a sail open in the wind or keep an anchor line from giving way. Rope walks give this chapter its miniature because they show how a plant became infrastructure. A rope walk was a long, narrow workspace where fibers were stretched, twisted, and laid into rope by practiced hands. Its length was not accidental. Long ropes required long spaces, and the workers moved through a rhythm of pulling, turning, tension, and measurement. Hemp fibers, once separated and prepared, were drawn into strands, strands into yarns, yarns into rope, and rope into the usable lines that ships carried in great coils. The finished object looked simple because the skill had disappeared into it. Such places often sat near dockyards or supply centers, where the needs of the sea met the labor of the land. The smell would have belonged to fiber, tar, damp wood, and stored material, but the history does not need to linger there to understand the scale. A single large vessel might require miles of cordage in different thicknesses. Naval yards could not improvise that demand at the last moment. They needed steady production, reliable supply, and administrative memory. Hemp was therefore pulled into the expanding machinery of European government. The Baltic world became especially important. Russia, the Baltic ports, and northern European trade supplied large quantities of hemp to Western maritime powers, including Britain and the Netherlands. Geography mattered here. The climates and agricultural systems of parts of Eastern and Northern Europe made hemp cultivation practical, while seafaring states with expanding fleets often needed more fiber than they could easily produce at home. A rope on an English ship might therefore begin its life in a field far from England, processed through trade routes that joined farmers, merchants, customs officers, and naval buyers. This dependence could trouble governments. A naval power did not like relying too heavily on foreign supply for the material that held its ships together. English and later British officials repeatedly showed interest in domestic hemp cultivation and secure supply lines. Similar concerns appeared elsewhere. States encouraged cultivation, issued rules, made contracts, inspected quality, and looked for ways to avoid shortages. Hemp became one of those materials whose importance is easiest to see whenever officials feared not having enough of it. The material details were exacting. Hemp intended for rope had to be strong, long-fibered, and properly processed. Retting, the soaking or controlled rotting that helped separate fiber from woody stem, required judgment. Too little, and the fibers resisted separation. Too much, and strength declined. After drying and breaking, the fibers had to be dressed and sorted. Quality mattered because bad rope could fail under strain, and failure at sea had consequences that no administrator could ignore. The plant's history here is a history of standards. Canvas carried the plant into another maritime form. The word canvas itself is historically connected with cannabis through older linguistic roots, a reminder that the plant's identity entered European language through material use. Sailcloth had to endure wind, moisture, and repeated handling. It was patched, folded, raised, lowered, and replaced. In the age of sail, fabric was power. A ship without sound sails was a body without breath. Hemp's place in that world was not decorative. It was part of motion itself. Paper offered a calmer but equally durable life. Medieval and early modern papermaking used rags from linen, hemp, and other plant fibers, depending on region and supply. The connection between hemp and paper does not mean every sheet was hemp, but it does mean the plant belonged to the broader material history of writing. A government order about hemp, a merchant's account of fiber prices, a shipyard ledger, or a medical note about cannabis might be written on paper made partly from the same wider family of fibrous materials. History often folds back on itself in such modest ways. Hemp's European story was also agricultural. It had to be planted, tended, harvested, and processed, and those tasks fit into local rural economies. The crop could be demanding. It took labor to pull or cut the stalks, bundle them, wet them in water or dew, dry them, break them, and prepare the fiber. In some places, retting created disputes because soaking hemp in ponds or streams could foul water. A plant valued by the state could still irritate a village. Its usefulness did not make its processing pleasant or simple. The distinction between hemp and intoxicating cannabis became socially important in Europe, even when people did not speak in modern chemical terms. Hemp was a respectable crop because it served visible economic and military purposes. Its identity was tied to rope, cloth, paper, and the navy. Preparations that altered the mind were much less central in most European records of this period, especially compared with parts of Asia, Africa, or the Islamic world. The same species family could therefore pass through European life under a practical name, softened by labor and state demand. There is a quiet irony in this. Later centuries would criminalize cannabis in many places by treating it as a dangerous social substance. Yet earlier European power leaned on hemp with little hesitation. Ships crossed seas under canvas and rope made from the plant's fiber. Merchants trusted cargo to it. Navies stored it. Farmers grew it. Papermakers reused its fibers. The plant was not outside order. It was part of order's equipment. European expansion made this material dependence global. As Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, and English ships moved across the Atlantic, around Africa, and into the Indian Ocean, they carried with them the physical needs of sailing technology. Hemp fiber belonged to those needs. Some supplies came from Europe, some from trade, some from colonial efforts to grow the crop closer to imperial demands. The plant that had once followed ancient movements across Eurasia was now being drawn into the much larger and harsher movements of empire. This movement also changed the scale of paperwork around hemp. Governments counted, ordered, inspected, subsidized, and complained. Merchants negotiated supply. Naval officers reported shortages. Farmers responded to incentives or resisted unprofitable demands. A plant can become powerful in history not because people praise it, but because bureaucracies keep returning to it. Hemp entered ledgers because ships needed it, and ledgers gave the plant another kind of permanence. The chapter of rope and canvas therefore sits between two larger histories. Behind it lies the older world of practical fiber, medicine, ritual, and moral unease. Ahead of it lies the Atlantic world, where European empires would try to place hemp inside colonial agriculture and state law. The plant's meaning would again shift with setting. In Europe's shipyards, it had been a naval necessity. Across the ocean, it would become a crop of statutes, labor, bounties, and imperial expectation. The same fiber that held sails in place would soon be pulled into colonial fields where the demands of empire reached down into soil and work. Chapter 8. Hemp in the Atlantic World. The Atlantic world gave hemp a new administrative life. The plant had already been useful in Europe, where rope, canvas, sacks, nets, and paper placed it inside the ordinary machinery of work and maritime power. Across the ocean, however, usefulness became policy. European empires did not merely want hemp. They wanted dependable supplies of hemp, grown close enough to imperial needs that ships, ports, armies, and merchant systems would not be left waiting on uncertain trade. In that desire, a plant that had once belonged to fields and rope walks entered the language of colonial statutes, bounties, inspections, and forced expectation. Virginia offers one of the clearest early settings. English colonists arrived in North America with the habits and anxieties of a maritime kingdom behind them, and hemp appeared among the crops that officials hoped the colonies could provide. Tobacco became the more famous plant of the Chesapeake because it drew profit, shaped landholding, and remade the colony's economy around export demand. Hemp had a different place. It was valued less for glamour than for utility, less for appetite than for empire. A colony that could grow hemp might help supply the cordage and canvas on which ships depended. The official interest in hemp did not mean that colonists always wanted to grow it. Farmers responded to soil, labor, price, demand, and risk. Tobacco could be more profitable. Food crops could be more urgent. Hemp required work after harvest, not merely planting and cutting. Stalks had to be processed, and processing took time, water, strength, and knowledge. A government might see a naval material. A farmer might see an awkward crop that occupied land and labor without promising the return that other crops could bring. Colonial laws and encouragements therefore became part of hemp's Atlantic identity. Officials in several colonies tried to promote its cultivation through requirements, incentives, or public appeals. These measures reveal the state's view of the plant more clearly than they reveal its everyday success. A statute can order a crop into importance, but it cannot make soil perfect, labor abundant, prices attractive, or farmers obedient. Hemp's colonial history sits partly inside that gap between imperial desire and local calculation. The material itself demanded patience. After the hemp plant matured, it had to be cut or pulled, bundled, and retted so the useful fibers could be separated from the woody core. Retting in water could be unpleasant and could disturb local streams or ponds. After drying, the stalks were broken, scutched, and hackled, each step drawing the fiber closer to the form needed for spinning or rope making. The labor was physical and repetitive. The clean rope in a naval storehouse hid the rougher work that had made it possible. This is where the Atlantic chapter cannot be told only as a story of crops and ships. Labor stood underneath it. In the colonial world, labor was often coerced. unfree, or sharply unequal. Indentured servants, enslaved Africans, poor farmers, hired hands, and family labor could all be drawn into agricultural and processing tasks depending on place and period. Hemp did not create those systems, but it entered them. A plant demanded by empire could become one more burden placed on bodies already held inside hard arrangements of power. Kentucky later became one of the major American hemp regions, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Its soils and inland river connections made hemp cultivation more attractive, and the crop became tied to rope, bagging, and the wider plantation economy. Hemp bagging was important for cotton, and cordage had countless agricultural and commercial uses. In this way, hemp did not only serve ships directly, it served other crops, other trades, and other systems of transport, including some of the most morally burdened economies of the Atlantic world. The miniature in this chapter belongs to the crop economy rather than to a single heroic figure. A Kentucky hemp field, in the historical record, was not just a green surface waiting to be harvested. It was attached to hemp breaks, retting areas, river movement, local markets, and the labor of enslaved people in many places before the Civil War. The stalks were broken by hand or by simple equipment to loosen the fiber. Bundles moved from farm to processor, from processor to market, and from market into rope, bagging, or bale. The plant's usefulness was real, but it was carried through an economy that could make usefulness costly for those who did the work. British demand remained part of the wider background. The Royal Navy needed hemp in enormous quantities, and for much of the 18th century Britain relied heavily on supplies from the Baltic and Russia. This dependence could become dangerous in wartime or diplomatic crisis. Empires prefer certainty, especially when uncertainty touches ships. Colonial hemp schemes, domestic cultivation efforts, and trade negotiations all belong to the same problem: how to secure the fibers that allowed maritime power to function. Russia's role in the hemp trade shows how global the material had become. Northern and Eastern European hemp traveled through ports, contracts, and merchant networks to supply Western navies. A British ship might depend on Russian hemp, colonial timber, Caribbean provisions, Indian textiles, and sailors from multiple shores. Empire was not a single line from capital to colony. It was a web of materials, and hemp ran through it as one of the fibers that made movement possible. In the American colonies, and later the United States, hemp also acquired a patriotic and developmental reputation at times. Public voices encouraged its cultivation as a sign of self-sufficiency. Farmers were urged to grow what the nation needed. Domestic hemp could be praised because it promised independence from foreign supply. This language could sound noble, but behind it remained the same practical question: who would plant it, process it, transport it, and accept the price offered? Hemp's relation to slavery and plantation agriculture deserves particular care. It would be misleading to say that hemp was the same as cotton, sugar, or tobacco in economic centrality across the Atlantic world. It was not. Yet in regions where enslaved labor processed hemp, the plant became part of the same broad system of forced agricultural work. The difficulty of hemp processing made labor especially important. Breaking hemp was hard on the body. The crop's quiet reputation as useful fiber should not make the labor behind it disappear. This is one of the reasons the Atlantic hemp story feels different from the European rope walk story. In Europe, hemp had already been tied to workers, rural processing, and state demand. Across the Atlantic, it entered societies structured by conquest, settlement, land seizure, and racial slavery. A plant does not carry guilt by itself, but it can become part of guilty systems. Hemp's history in the Atlantic world is therefore neither romantic nor scandalous in a simple way. It is a material history placed inside an imperial world. Hemp also moved through law in ways that show the practical mind of colonial government. Some colonies required certain amounts to be planted. Others offered bounties or accepted hemp for public purposes. Inspectors might judge quality. Merchants might complain about irregular supply. Farmers might ignore official encouragement when the market did not reward them. The plant appears in this paperwork as a problem to be solved, a crop that officials knew they wanted but could not always make people produce in the desired quantity or quality. The difference between hemp and other cannabis preparations remained important. In the Atlantic colonial world, officials were not primarily thinking about cannabis as a psychoactive substance. They were thinking about fiber. Later centuries would attach very different meanings to the word cannabis or marijuana, but these colonial hemp records belong to a world of rope, bagging, sales, sacks, and state supply. The same botanical family carried meanings that had not yet collapsed into the modern drug debate. River transport helped shape American hemp regions. Heavy agricultural goods needed routes to market, and rivers offered movement before railroads fully changed the landscape. Hemp could move down waterways toward processing centers and commercial towns. In Kentucky and surrounding regions, the crop's value depended not only on soil and labor, but on the ability to connect inland farms with buyers. A plant in a field became a commodity only when roads, rivers, warehouses, credit, and demand allowed it to leave the place where it grew. There is a quiet continuity between the ancient and Atlantic stories. In both, cannabis became important because it solved material problems. Early communities needed binding, cloth, seed, and useful fiber. Maritime empires needed rope and canvas. Colonial economies needed bagging, cordage, and supply. The forms changed, the scale grew, and the moral world around the plant became harsher, but the underlying usefulness remained. Cannabis continued to be carried into history by the simple fact that its fibers held. At the same time, the Atlantic world prepared the ground for a later transformation. Empire did not only move crops, it moved knowledge. British officials, physicians, merchants, and soldiers traveled through India, the Caribbean, North America, and other colonial spaces, encountering local plant practices and translating them into European categories. In the 19th century, that imperial habit of observation would turn cannabis once again toward medicine. The plant that had been counted in bales and twisted into rope would soon appear in apothecary bottles, medical journals, colonial reports, and the careful experiments of physicians trying to understand what older traditions had already known in their own language. Chapter 9. The Apothecary Bottle. The 19th century carried cannabis into a new kind of room. After the fields, rope walks, ships, markets, and ritual settings of earlier centuries, the plant began to appear more visibly on the shelves of Western medicine, reduced into extracts, tinctures, and carefully described preparations. It was not new to healing. Chinese, Indian, Islamic, and Mediterranean traditions had all placed cannabis inside medical or bodily knowledge in one form or another. What changed in the 19th century was the institutional path by which older uses were translated into the language of European science, colonial observation, and printed medical authority. British India became one of the most important settings for this transformation. The British Empire did not merely govern territory. It collected information, classified plants, studied climates, measured populations, recorded diseases, and turned local knowledge into reports that could travel back to London, Edinburgh, Dublin, Paris, and Philadelphia. This process was often unequal, because the knowledge of Indian physicians, vendors, patients, and household practice could be absorbed into imperial medicine without equal credit. Yet it also meant that cannabis, long known in South Asia through bhang, ganja, charas, and medical preparation, entered Western medical discussion with unusual force. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy stands near the center of this chapter. An Irish physician working in India, he became interested in cannabis during the 1830s when colonial medical officers were constantly encountering substances that did not sit neatly inside European pharmacology. O'Shaughnessy studied Indian hemp preparations, observed their use, experimented cautiously according to the medical habits of his age, and published work that drew attention in Britain. His role was not that of a discoverer in the absolute sense. He did not invent cannabis medicine. He helped translate it into a form that Western medical institutions were prepared to recognize. This is a familiar pattern in imperial history. A practice can be old in one culture and still be announced as new when it enters the archive of another. Cannabis had long been prepared, named, and interpreted in India before O'Shaughnessy wrote about it for European readers. Yet his reports mattered because 19th century medicine trusted certain channels of authority: the hospital, the medical journal, the colonial officer, the laboratory table, the case note, and the printed lecture. Once cannabis passed through those channels, it became easier for European and American physicians to discuss it as medicine rather than curiosity. The miniature in this chapter begins with a medical case rather than with a grand theory. O'Shaughnessy described cannabis preparations in relation to conditions such as pain, convulsions, rheumatism, and spasmodic disorders, and what made his writing influential was the careful connection between observed effect and medical possibility. A patient's body responded. The physician noted the response. The preparation was adjusted, and the report turned local substance into professional evidence. The process sounds orderly on the page, though the world behind it was more complex. Colonial hospitals, Indian suppliers, uncertain dosages, varied plant strength, and the limits of 19th century medicine all stood behind each line. Cannabis entered European medical use partly because physicians were searching for remedies in a period before many modern drugs existed. Pain relief, sleep, appetite, muscle spasm, convulsions, and nervous disorders could be difficult to treat. Opium was powerful but dangerous and habit-forming. Alcohol, chloroform, ether, bromides, and many plant preparations carried their own risks and limitations. A substance that seemed to ease pain, calm spasms, or help sleep without some of opium's immediate dangers attracted attention. Cannabis did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as a possibility in a crowded and imperfect medical cabinet. The apothecary bottle gave cannabis a new appearance. Instead of a field stalk, a ritual drink, a cake of hashish, or a rope fiber, it appeared as extract of cannabis, tincture of cannabis, or Indian hemp. The label mattered. A label made the plant legible to the pharmacist and the physician. The dark glass bottle, the measured drop, the written dose, and the physician's instruction changed the plant's social setting. It could now sit beside other medicines, not because its nature had changed, but because the institution around it had changed. Dosage, however, remained a persistent problem. Cannabis preparations varied in strength depending on the plant, the part used, the method of preparation, storage, age, and the skill of the manufacturer. A tincture made from one supply might not behave exactly like another. This uncertainty troubled physicians who wanted predictable results. 19th century medicine was moving slowly towards standardization, but many plant drugs resisted exact control. Cannabis was one of them. It could be useful enough to prescribe and variable enough to frustrate. Medical journals spread its reputation. Reports moved from India to Britain, from Britain to Europe, and across the Atlantic to North America. Physicians read one another's cases, repeated trials, confirmed some claims, doubted others, and added cannabis to discussions of treatment. It appeared in pharmacopoeias and commercial preparations. The plant had entered the official paper world of medicine, where substances gained credibility through citation, formulation, and repetition. A remedy did not need universal success to become part of practice. It needed enough observed usefulness to remain in circulation. American medicine also adopted cannabis preparations during the 19th century. Pharmacies could stock extracts and tinctures. Physicians might prescribe them for pain, insomnia, migraine, menstrual discomfort, neuralgia, or other conditions, depending on medical fashion and personal experience. Patent medicines and commercial preparations sometimes complicated the picture, because the boundary between professional medicine and market promise was not always clean. The 19th century drug trade was full of confidence, experimentation, exaggeration, and genuine relief, often mixed in the same bottle. The plant's medical identity in this period did not erase its other identities. In India, cannabis still belonged to social, ritual, and recreational settings. In the Islamic world, hashish still carried moral and legal associations. In Europe and America, hemp remained a material crop in some places. The medicine bottle was therefore not a replacement for earlier meanings. It was another layer. Cannabis had become a crop, a fiber, a ritual substance, a social concern, and now a pharmaceutical preparation in the modernizing sense of that word. The physician's interest also brought the plant into a new kind of authority. Earlier cannabis use had often been embedded in household custom, religious occasion, or local medicine. The 19th century doctor resituated it inside professional judgment. This could protect the plant from moral suspicion when it appeared as a prescribed medicine, but it could also narrow who was allowed to speak about it. A patient might experience relief. A local practitioner might know a preparation well, but the printed authority belonged increasingly to the professional medical man and the institutions that recognized him. There is a quiet tension in that transfer. Western medicine gained from the knowledge it encountered in India, but it often changed the ownership of that knowledge. A preparation known through long social use could become, in European writing, a substance validated only when confirmed by colonial experiment. This was not unique to cannabis. Many plants traveled through empire in the same way. Cinchona, ipecacuanha, coca, opium, tea, and countless other substances moved through unequal networks of trade, observation, extraction, and classification. Cannabis belonged to that imperial traffic of useful nature. As the century moved forward, cannabis medicine remained present but imperfect. Some physicians praised it, others found it unreliable. New drugs and new techniques entered practice. Chloral hydrate, aspirin, injectable morphine, barbiturates, and other substances began to reshape medical expectations. A medicine that varied from batch to batch could lose ground in a profession increasingly drawn toward precision. Cannabis did not disappear at once, but its place became less secure as medicine's standards changed around it. Legal and cultural attitudes also began to shift. In the 19th century, cannabis could still be discussed as a medicine without the full weight of 20th century drug panic. But concerns about intoxication, habit, public order, race, immigration, and urban life were growing around many substances. Opium smoking, alcohol, patent medicines, morphine, cocaine, and other drugs all became part of broader anxieties about self-control and social discipline. Cannabis would eventually be drawn into that larger moral and legal atmosphere, though not everywhere at the same pace. The change in names helped prepare the change in meaning. Indian hemp, cannabis indica, cannabis extract, ganja, hashish, marijuana, and hemp did not all carry the same social associations. A doctor's cannabis tincture could seem respectable. A foreign-sounding preparation could seem suspect. A word associated with immigrant communities or racialized fears could become politically useful to those seeking control. The plant itself did not need to alter for its public identity to change. Language could do that work. The apothecary period is therefore one of the most revealing passages in cannabis history. It shows the plant at a point of relative respectability in Western medicine, but also at the edge of forces that would later restrict it. It had entered professional practice through colonial pathways. It had shown enough effect to be taken seriously. It had also shown enough variability to make doctors cautious. It was familiar in one setting and strange in another, legitimate under one label and suspicious under a different one. By the opening decades of the 20th century, the bottle on the pharmacy shelf had not vanished, but the world around it was changing. Governments were beginning to regulate drugs more closely. International agreements were bringing narcotic substances into diplomatic language. Newspapers and officials were learning to turn certain plants and preparations into public fears. Cannabis would soon leave the relatively calm pages of medical discussion and enter a harsher archive of tax forms, police files, racialized campaigns, and federal hearings, where its identity would be remade once again under the pressure of law. Chapter 10: The Tax Stamp and the New Fear. The early 20th century changed cannabis by changing the language around it. In the 19th century, a physician might have known cannabis as an extract, a tincture, or Indian hemp, something imperfect but familiar enough to appear in medical catalogues and pharmacy shelves. Hemp remained a material crop in some settings, attached to rope, cloth, and agricultural use. Yet another word began to gather force in the United States, and then beyond it: marijuana. The spelling varied, the pronunciation carried foreignness to many English-speaking ears, and the word helped separate the plant from its older medical and agricultural identities. This shift did not happen all at once. Drug regulation had been tightening across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially around opium, cocaine, morphine, patent medicines, and alcohol. Governments were becoming more interested in labeling, taxation, prescription, import control, and public order. The progressive era in the United States placed many substances under new scrutiny, not only because officials feared intoxication, but because they wanted to make the body, the household, the city, and the market more legible to law. Cannabis entered that growing regulatory world after other drugs had already prepared the administrative path. State laws came before the federal turning point. Several American states restricted cannabis in the early 20th century, often through poison laws, pharmacy rules, or narcotics statutes. These measures did not always arise from the same concern. Some reflected professional pharmacy regulation. Some grew from broader anti-narcotic policy. Some were tied to local anxieties about laborers, immigrants, black communities, Mexican migrants, musicians, or urban vice. The plant's identity became less medical and more social. It was increasingly imagined not as something in a physician's cabinet, but as something circulating among people whom authorities already watched with suspicion. Mexican migration, after the Mexican Revolution, played a large role in the American public meaning of marijuana. People moving north brought language, customs, music, labor, food, religion, family networks, and sometimes cannabis smoking traditions. In the southwestern United States, local officials and newspapers often treated Mexican communities through a lens of fear and racial prejudice. The word marijuana itself could be used to make cannabis sound separate from the older hemp and cannabis medicines that many Americans had encountered without alarm. A change in naming became a change in atmosphere. The press amplified the new fear. Newspapers in some cities described cannabis with language that was vivid, racialized, and often careless. Stories linked the plant to violence, madness, moral collapse, or criminality, sometimes with little evidence beyond rumor and repetition. Such stories did not need to be accurate to be influential. They needed to be memorable. A frightening anecdote could travel faster than a medical qualification, and in public life a repeated exaggeration can become part of the background against which laws are made. Harry Anslinger entered this developing world as one of its most important federal figures. In 1930, he became the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, an agency created inside the United States Treasury Department. Anslinger's bureau inherited a drug control mission already focused heavily on opiates and cocaine. but cannabis became increasingly useful to its public work. A federal agency needs a problem it can define, pursue, and explain. Cannabis, under the name marijuana, could be presented as a spreading danger that required national attention. The miniature of this chapter belongs to the record of hearings and paperwork rather than to a dramatic raid. In 1937, federal attention gathered around what became the Marijuana Tax Act. The measure did not simply declare cannabis illegal in the clean language later generations might expect. It used taxation, registration, transfer rules, and penalties to make lawful handling difficult and risky. Dealers, physicians, and others who dealt with the substance were placed inside a framework of forms, stamps, and obligations. The instrument looked administrative, but administration can be a powerful form of prohibition. The tax stamp itself is a small object with a large historical meaning. It turned the plant into something that had to pass through federal recognition before it could be handled safely under law. To possess or transfer cannabis without complying with the system could bring punishment. A farmer, physician, pharmacist, researcher, or seller no longer faced merely a plant or a preparation, but a set of documents. This is one of the quieter ways law changes reality. It places paper between the hand and the object, and then punishes the hand that reaches without paper. Medical voices did not all welcome the act. The American Medical Association, through testimony by Dr. William C. Woodward, raised objections about the legislation and its effect on medical practice. Woodward argued that the profession had not been properly consulted and that the term marijuana obscured the connection to cannabis medicines known to physicians. His objection reveals how much language mattered. If lawmakers and the public heard marijuana as a frightening foreign drug, they might not recognize it as the same plant family that had appeared in medical formularies. Anslinger and his allies presented cannabis as a danger to public safety and moral order. Their arguments often drew on alarming stories and racialized associations. The Bureau's language attached cannabis to violence, insanity, and social decay, even when the evidence was weak or exaggerated. Such claims made the plant easier to control because they moved it out of the calm pharmacy shelf and into the world of fear. A substance seen as medicine invites regulation. A substance seen as a threat invites punishment. There is an important distinction here between evidence and effect. The claims made in anti-cannabis campaigns were often poor as science, but they were effective as public language. They helped shape what legislators thought they were acting against. They helped ordinary readers imagine cannabis users as dangerous strangers. They helped federal authority extend itself into a field where earlier medical and agricultural identities had been more complex. The law did not need a complete truth to make a lasting category. It needed a usable fear. The 1937 Act also arrived during a period when the United States was defining many substances through taxation and federal power. Alcohol prohibition had ended only a few years earlier in 1933, but the machinery and memory of moral regulation had not disappeared. Opiates and cocaine were already under federal control. The government had learned how to connect public health, morality, revenue, policing, and professional licensing. Cannabis entered an existing administrative habit. It did not create the regulatory state. It was absorbed by it. The effect on medicine was gradual but serious. Cannabis preparations had already been losing ground because of inconsistent potency, newer pharmaceuticals, and professional changes. The 1937 framework added legal difficulty and stigma. Physicians could still technically use cannabis under certain conditions, but the burden and suspicion around it increased. A medicine that had once been imperfect but available became inconvenient, watched, and increasingly unfashionable. In medicine, a substance can fade not only because it fails, but because the world around it makes use harder. Hemp agriculture was also affected, though the story was not simple. Industrial hemp, and psychoactive cannabis were not identical in use, but law and public fear often pulled them into the same shadow. During the Second World War, the United States briefly encouraged hemp production through the Hemp for Victory campaign, because wartime supply needs returned attention to fiber. This moment showed the contradiction clearly. A plant recently framed as dangerous could be summoned again as patriotic material when rope, cordage, and naval supply required it. The old identity had not vanished. It had been covered by a newer one. After the war, however, the restrictive identity remained stronger. Cannabis became more firmly attached to criminal law, youth anxiety, racialized policing, and later the broader language of narcotics control. The Tax Act had helped move the plant into a federal category, and once a category exists, institutions begin to build around it. Police training, court cases, newspaper habits, school warnings, and international diplomacy all drew on the idea that cannabis was no longer an old crop with multiple histories, but a controlled substance needing suppression. The transformation was not only legal, it was cultural. Words like hemp, cannabis, Indian hemp, marijuana, hashish, and marijuana carried different associations, and 20th century America learned to hear them differently. Hemp sounded agricultural or old-fashioned. Cannabis sounded medical or botanical. Marijuana sounded foreign, dangerous, and socially suspect to many ears formed by the campaigns of the period. Later spelling would settle more often as marijuana, but the early public force of the word came partly from its ability to make the familiar unfamiliar. This is one of the most consequential turns in the plant's history. Earlier societies had disagreed about cannabis, regulated it, used it, praised it, condemned it, and classified it. The 20th century United States did something more administratively durable. It helped remake cannabis as an object of modern drug control, tied to paperwork, enforcement, race, fear, and federal authority. That model did not remain confined within one country. American influence, international conferences, and the growing global system of narcotics regulation would carry similar categories outward. The chapter closes with cannabis standing inside a new archive. The plant that had moved through Chinese fields, Indian cups, Scythian burials, Mediterranean medical catalogues, Islamic legal debate, European rope walks, Atlantic farms, and 19th century pharmacies now appeared in tax forms, hearing transcripts, federal files, and police language. Its older identities were still present, but they were increasingly harder to see beneath the official label. From that point, the next transformation would happen not only in national law, but in international treaties, where diplomats and institutions learned to schedule a plant for the world. Chapter 11. The world learns to schedule a plant. International law gave cannabis a colder kind of identity. Before the 20th century, the plant had moved through fields, markets, medical books, rituals, ships, colonial ledgers, and local prohibitions, but its meanings remained uneven. One place knew hemp as fiber, another knew bang as ritual preparation, another knew hashish as a moral concern in the city, another knew cannabis extract as a medicine. The modern treaty system did something different. It gathered these varied histories into administrative categories and taught governments to speak of the plant through schedules, controls, permissions, and offenses. The rise of international drug control did not begin with cannabis. Opium stood at the center of the earliest global efforts, especially because of imperial trade, addiction, missionary concern, Chinese resistance, and diplomatic pressure around the opium traffic. Cocaine and morphine also drew attention as modern chemistry made powerful substances easier to isolate, transport, and prescribe. Cannabis entered a system whose language had already been shaped by other drugs. That mattered, because once officials had created a machinery of control, new substances could be inserted into it with less need to ask whether their histories were actually the same. The post-war world made this machinery more formal. After the Second World War, the United Nations inherited and reorganized older international drug control efforts, The language was sober, bureaucratic, and technical. Committees, conventions, schedules, estimates, import certificates, medical exceptions, and enforcement obligations replaced the older patchwork of local custom and imperial rule. A plant that had once been known through preparation and setting was now increasingly known through treaty language. The difference was quiet but enormous. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs became one of the defining instruments of this new order. Its purpose was to consolidate earlier agreements and bring narcotic substances under a coordinated international framework. Cannabis and cannabis resin were placed under control, and cultivation, trade, possession, medical use, scientific use, and national reporting all became matters that governments were expected to manage within treaty obligations. The plant did not vanish into the treaty, but it was translated by it. A leaf, a resin, a crop, a medicine, and a social practice became entries in a legal structure. The miniature of this chapter begins with treaty language because treaties often change history without looking dramatic. A conference room, a draft article, a schedule, a definition, a signature, and a ratification can alter the lives of people who will never read the document itself. The Single Convention did not need to describe a village field, a patient's pain, a farmer's crop, a musician's habit, or a pharmacist's shelf in detail. It needed only to define what states were expected to control. Once that definition entered national law, many smaller histories had to pass through it. A treaty schedule is an unusual kind of container. It does not store the plant physically, yet it holds the plant in the mind of the state. Police, customs officials, doctors, researchers, judges, farmers, and patients begin to meet the substance through the category assigned to it. The schedule shapes permissions and punishments. It influences what research is easy or difficult, what medicine is available or suspect, what crops can be grown, and what kinds of people become visible to law enforcement. The object itself remains botanical, but its public life becomes administrative. This was not merely an abstract change. National governments built domestic systems around the treaty framework and around their own political fears. Some countries used strict criminal penalties, others maintained medical exceptions but made them narrow. Some tolerated traditional uses for a time, others tried to suppress them. In many places, cannabis became part of a wider narcotics policy that made little room for the plant's older variety of meanings. The practical result was a narrowing of legal imagination. Cannabis could be medicine only under tightly defined permission, crop only under industrial exception, and ordinary use mostly as a fence. There is a quiet historical irony here. The treaty system aimed to create order, but it often did so by flattening difference. Hemp fiber, cannabis resin, medicinal preparation, local ritual use, and recreational smoking did not carry the same history, the same risks, or the same social setting. Yet law works most efficiently when it can sort messy reality into stable categories. Cannabis became easier to govern when it became easier to name, and easier to name when much of its older complexity was set aside. The Cold War years gave cannabis another layer of meaning. In the United States and parts of Europe, cannabis became associated with youth culture, jazz, and later rock music. Anti-war movements, civil rights struggles, student rebellion, and changing sexual and social norms. The plant's effect mattered, but so did its symbolism. To some users, it represented pleasure, dissent, creativity, or distance from older forms of authority. To many officials and parents, it represented loosened discipline, disrespect, and social instability. The plant became a small object through which larger generational anxieties could be expressed. The counterculture did not invent cannabis use, but it changed the visibility of cannabis in modern Western societies. Public festivals, university circles, music scenes, and anti-war communities made the plant part of a broader language of refusal. For governments already shaped by treaty obligations and domestic drug laws, this visibility confirmed existing suspicion. Enforcement did not only respond to intoxication, it responded to the people and politics associated with the substance. Once again, cannabis was judged partly by the social identity of those imagined to be using it. Law enforcement expanded around that judgment. Police searches, arrests, customs inspections, border controls, sentencing policies, and prison systems gave cannabis a place in the everyday machinery of the state. The plant that had once been twisted into rope for ships now drew people into courts and jails. The comparison is not a moral lesson, it is a change in institutional setting. A substance becomes historically different when the hand that handles it is no longer a farmer's hand or a physician's hand, but the hand of an officer filling out a report. Public health language developed alongside enforcement. Governments and medical authorities warned about risks, dependency, mental health, youth use, impaired driving, and the relationship between cannabis and other drugs. Some concerns were grounded in real questions, others were exaggerated, poorly studied, or shaped by the politics of the moment. The difficulty for the historian is to avoid both dismissal and panic. Cannabis was neither harmless simply because it was old, nor monstrous simply because 20th century law described it that way. Its modern history sits between evidence, fear, policy, and culture. Scientific research faced its own complications. Because cannabis was controlled, studying it became more difficult in many places. Researchers needed permissions, supply, institutional approval, and legal protection. This did not stop research entirely, but it shaped the pace and direction of inquiry. A plant placed under strict control can become both highly discussed and poorly understood. Public argument may grow louder while scientific access remains narrow. The treaty and scheduling systems therefore influenced not only law, but knowledge itself. The discovery and study of cannabinoids began to change this picture gradually. Scientists identified and studied chemical compounds in the plant, including tetrahydrocannabinol, often known as THC, and later explored the body's own cannabinoid signaling systems. This research did not immediately overturn prohibition, but it complicated older categories. A plant long treated as a crude narcotic could now be discussed through receptors, compounds, dosage, therapeutic potential, and risk profiles. The laboratory did not make the legal debate disappear, it gave the debate a new vocabulary. Meanwhile, older forms of cannabis use continued in many regions of the world despite international control. In parts of South Asia, North Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, Latin America, and elsewhere, local practices persisted under different levels of enforcement, tolerance, or suppression. The treaty system created a global language, but it did not create a single global reality. A farmer in one country, a patient in another, a religious practitioner elsewhere, and an urban consumer in a fourth place could all live under the shadow of the same broad international framework, while experiencing very different degrees of danger or acceptance. This unevenness reveals one of the central features of modern cannabis history. International control was global in ambition, but local life remained stubbornly varied. Some governments punished possession harshly, others allowed limited medical use. Some ignored small-scale traditional practice while targeting trade. Some enforced laws selectively, often along class, racial, ethnic, or political lines. The plant's official category might be international, but its human consequences were local. Medical cannabis returned as a public issue, partly because patients, doctors, researchers, and activists began to challenge the narrowness of that category. People dealing with cancer treatment, chronic pain, HIV/AIDS, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and other conditions argued that cannabis or cannabis-derived medicines could offer relief where existing treatments failed or caused difficult side effects. Their claims did not all carry the same quality of evidence, and not every demand was scientifically settled. Yet patient testimony had a political force that treaty language could not easily absorb. The late 20th century therefore placed two histories against each other. On one side stood the administrative history of control, schedules, conventions, police powers, customs offices, and criminal penalties. On the other stood the older and newly revived history of use, medicine, relief, habit, pleasure, ritual, and local knowledge. Neither side was entirely new. The difference was that modern institutions had made the conflict more formal. Cannabis was no longer only argued over in markets, temples, clinics, or city streets. It was argued over in legislatures, courts, research boards, and international agencies. As the century approached its end, the categories began to loosen in some places. Medical exceptions appeared. Decriminalization debates gained strength. Courts heard cases. Voters in certain jurisdictions were asked to decide what the law should allow. Scientists continued to study the plant's compounds. While public opinion shifted unevenly across countries and generations, the treaty system remained, but its authority was now surrounded by practical questions that it had not fully settled. The world had learned to schedule a plant, but scheduling had not ended the plant's history. It had only given cannabis another identity, one of the most powerful it had ever carried. After fiber, seed, ritual, medicine, maritime material, colonial crop, pharmacy extract, and feared narcotic, cannabis had become an administrative object of international order. From that place, its next movement would not be a simple return to the past. It would be a return under new names, shaped by patience, laboratories, elections, markets, doctors, and governments trying to decide whether an old plant could be made legible again without becoming simple. Chapter 12. The old plant returns under new names. The late 20th century did not bring cannabis back from disappearance, because the plant had never truly disappeared. It had remained in fields, informal markets, private rooms, religious habits, police records, prison files, medical memories, and scientific questions that older laws had not erased. What changed was the public language around it. After decades in which many governments had treated cannabis mainly as a narcotic problem, patients, doctors, researchers, voters, courts, and legislators began to reopen a history that prohibition had tried to close. The return did not begin as a smooth reform. It began unevenly, often through suffering. Patients living with serious illness looked toward cannabis not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a possible source of relief. Some were dealing with the effects of cancer treatment. Others lived with HIV and AIDS, chronic pain, glaucoma, multiple sclerosis, seizure disorders, wasting, nausea, or other conditions that made ordinary life difficult. In many places, their testimony forced a different question into the public record. The question was no longer only whether cannabis could be misused, but whether the law should prevent sick people from seeking help. California became one of the most visible settings for this change. In the 1980s and 1990s, especially during the AIDS crisis, activists, patients, caregivers, and sympathetic physicians began pressing for access to cannabis as medicine. The older federal category remained severe, but the human stories were difficult to keep inside that category. A patient who could eat after nausea, sleep after pain, or endure treatment more easily did not fit the image created by decades of warning campaigns. Medical need softened the outline of the forbidden object. The miniature here begins with patient history rather than political victory. In San Francisco and other places, people associated with AIDS activism helped build informal networks of access before the law fully recognized what they were doing. Their work was practical before it was legislative. They connected patients with cannabis, gathered testimony, challenged police action, and made compassion a public argument. This was not the old 19th century apothecary bottle with a physician writing a dose in professional language. It was a later kind of medicine politics, built from patients insisting that their own bodies had to count as evidence. In 1996, California's Proposition 215 marked a major turn by allowing medical cannabis under state law. It did not resolve the conflict with federal prohibition, and it did not create a simple or uniform system. What it did was break the idea that cannabis law had to move in only one direction. A state had opened a legal space for medical use, and other states would eventually follow in different ways. The plant entered a new kind of uncertainty, not the uncertainty of ancient archaeology or medieval testimony, but the uncertainty of overlapping legal systems. This is one of the notable features of modern cannabis history. The plant returned not as one thing, but as several things at once. To one office, it remained an illegal drug. To another, it became a medicine. To a patient, it might be relief. To a physician, a difficult recommendation. To a researcher, a complex plant chemistry. To a business, a market. To a police department, a changing enforcement problem. To a farmer, hemp again became a crop. The old multiplicity had returned, but now it had to pass through licenses, ballots, regulations, packaging rules, laboratory tests, and court decisions. Scientific language also changed the discussion. During the 20th century, researchers identified major cannabinoids, including THC, the compound most associated with intoxication, and CBD, which later became widely discussed for different potential effects. Scientists also described the endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors and signaling molecules in the body involved in many physiological processes. This did not make cannabis simple. It made it more complicated in a different way. The plant was no longer only leaf, resin, smoke, tincture, or law code entry. It became chemistry, receptor activity, dosage, formulation, and clinical trial. A modern laboratory sees cannabis through instruments that ancient physicians and household preparers could not have imagined. Compounds are isolated, potency is measured, ratios are compared, extracts are standardized, questions are asked about pain, nausea, epilepsy, appetite, anxiety, sleep, dependence, cognition, psychosis risk, and drug interaction. Some claims receive stronger evidence than others. Some remain uncertain. Science did not simply vindicate every old use, and it did not confirm every modern promise. It gave the plant a more disciplined vocabulary, while also revealing how much remained unsettled. The legal return of hemp followed its own path. Industrial hemp, long overshadowed by drug control laws, reappeared as governments began distinguishing low-THC cannabis grown for fiber, seed, oil, food products, textiles, building materials, and other uses. This was, in one sense, a return to the oldest cannabis history. The stem mattered again, the seed mattered again. Rope and cloth were joined by hempcrete, protein powders, seed oils, paper, animal bedding, and modern industrial experiments. The plant's material identity, covered for decades by drug law, became visible once more. Yet even this return carried ambiguity. A hemp field could look like a cannabis field to someone without botanical or legal knowledge. Farmers needed certified seed, testing, licenses, and compliance rules. A crop once grown for practical fiber now had to prove chemically that it was not something else. This is a very modern condition. An ancient plant asked to show its identity through laboratory thresholds. Hemp had never stopped being hemp, but law required it to speak in numbers. Uruguay became the first country to legalize and regulate cannabis for adult use at the national level in the 21st century, and Canada later followed with a national framework. In the United States, state-level reforms moved ahead while federal law remained more restrictive, creating one of the most complicated legal patchworks in the modern world. Some countries allowed medical access, others decriminalized possession, others retained severe penalties. Europe moved unevenly. Latin America debated cultivation, medicine, and enforcement. Africa, Asia, and the Middle East held a wide range of policies shaped by local law, religion, international pressure, agriculture, and politics. The global picture remained unsettled because cannabis carried too many histories to be governed easily by one model. A country thinking about medical access faced one set of questions. A country thinking about commercial legalization faced another. A country with older religious or traditional use faced another. A country concerned about youth use, organized crime, public health, or international obligations faced still others. Legal reform did not remove conflict. It changed the room in which conflict happened. Commercial legalization brought its own transformation. Cannabis became packaging, branding, retail design, taxation, advertising restrictions, laboratory certification, supply chains, investor language, and product categories. Flower, oil, edible, tincture, capsule, vapor product, topical preparation, and pharmaceutical extract each carried a different social meaning. The plant that once passed through rope walks and apothecaries now passed through compliance software, seed-to-sale tracking, and regulated storefronts. Modern markets did what markets often do. They multiplied forms. There is a quiet danger in this multiplication. When cannabis becomes an industry, the older patient history can be overshadowed by profit, and the older criminal history can be forgotten by those who enter the market legally after others were punished for the same plant. Many reform debates therefore began to include questions of expungement, social equity, community repair, and who should benefit from legalization. The plant's history had not been morally neutral in its consequences. Laws had fallen unevenly, and reform could not fully escape the memory of enforcement. Medicine also remained more complicated than public enthusiasm sometimes allowed. Some cannabis-based medicines became regulated pharmaceutical products. Some plant preparations were used under medical programs with varying degrees of evidence and oversight. Some patients reported relief where other treatments had failed. At the same time, physicians and researchers continued to ask careful questions about dosage, age, mental health, pregnancy, dependency, impaired driving, long-term use, and the difference between medical supervision and commercial promotion. The old double status returned again, useful and risky, promising and limited, familiar and poorly understood. The word cannabis itself regained strength because it sounded more clinical and botanical than marijuana, and because many people wanted language less tied to the racialized campaigns of the early 20th century. Hemp returned as an agricultural word, cannabinoid became a scientific word, medical cannabis became a policy word, adult use cannabis became a regulatory word. Marijuana remained common in law and speech, but it no longer carried the whole public meaning of the plant. Once again, names changed the story. Modernity did not discover cannabis. It renamed it. The oldest layers remained beneath the newest ones. Fiber and seed still belonged to the plant. Medicine still belonged to it. Ritual memory still belonged to it in some societies. Pleasure, risk, law, fear, relief, trade, and argument all remained attached in different ways. The difference was that the modern world had surrounded the plant with institutions capable of measuring, licensing, punishing, marketing, prescribing, testing, and taxing it at a scale earlier societies never knew. The final movement of this history does not need a verdict. Cannabis has been too many things for too long to rest comfortably inside one conclusion. It was useful before it was controversial. It was classified before it was criminalized. It was medicine before it was scheduled, and fiber before it was medicine. It entered human life through hands that needed to bind, heal, eat, soothe, pray, trade, sail, write, regulate, and endure. Each century took hold of it differently, and none of those centuries held the whole plant. A hemp cord, twisted from pale fiber, belongs near the beginning of the story and near the end. So does a seed pressed for oil, a page made from rag and plant fiber, a physician's bottle, a treaty schedule, a patient's form, a laboratory sample, and a field grown under license beneath a modern sky. They do not explain one another completely. They simply show how long the plant has been passing through human systems, changing its name whenever it crossed into a new one. The argument that surrounds cannabis today is loud because the history behind it is crowded. Farmers, priests, physicians, sailors, jurists, colonists, enslaved workers, apothecaries, police officers, diplomats, patients, scientists, voters, and lawmakers all left some mark on the same plant. Not all marks were equal. Some were gentle, some were coercive, some were careless, some were precise. Yet together they made cannabis into one of the rare natural things whose history can be followed through cloth, medicine, empire, law, and the body at once. Long before the latest statute, there was the stem. Long before the laboratory report, there was the seed. Long before the court file, there was the fiber pulled and worked until it held. The plant remains there, beneath the names placed over it, rooted in soil and weather, offering material that human beings keep turning into meaning. The rope slackens in a storehouse, the seed rests dry in a sack. A page lies flat under a careful hand. Somewhere, a field continues its ordinary green, and the long record of use, fear, relief, labor, and return grows still enough to be left there, unfinished, in the quiet persistence of the plant itself. The journey is complete. Rest well.